We have a cast in front of us, and we're going to design this cast, and we need to know what classification we have. We have an edentulous area posterior to that molar, but we're not going to replace it with any teeth. We don't have any opposing ones on the opposite arch. And that, therefore, is not considered in our classification at all. We have to look at the most posterior edentulous area to determine our classification, and we will replace these teeth back here. So this is the most posterior edentulous area, and what we have is a single edentulous area posterior to the remaining natural teeth. That, by definition, is our classic Kennedy Class 2. We do have one other edentulous area that helps and is not in determination of our classification, so this would make it a Kennedy Class 2 Modification 1. The fulcrum line on the Kennedy Class 2 goes between these most posterior teeth, and our partial denture is going to want to rotate around that fulcrum line. We're going to help prevent that rotation, one, by putting clasping on these two, which are considered our primary abutments. When we see this rotation wanting to take place as the patient eats some hard food on this area where we have no posterior support, this partial denture wants to go downward, and in order to prevent that, we're going to put a clasp on this other tooth that is next to our edentulous area over here, and that is a secondary abutment, and we will have a clasp there also. When the patient eats sticky foods, that partial denture wants to rotate in an upward direction on that extension base side, and we will counteract that by placing an indirect retainer anterior to our fulcrum line on this partial denture design. So we have three teeth that will be clasped with our Kennedy Class 2. These are primary abutments. This is our secondary abutment. This particular molar over here is our primary abutment, and on the primary abutment that is this molar, we can do very rigid clasping. It's also on a tooth-supported side, so we can do very rigid clasping on this tooth. So because of that, we would be thinking a cast circumferential clasping system on here. And we would ideally like to be able to put a mesial rest and take a couple of arms, one to the distal facial or one to the distal lingual, depending on where our undercuts are located. So we're going to look for undercuts on the buccal and on the distal lingual, but at the same time we're going to look for them on the mesial buccal and the mesial lingual, because this tooth back here, when it doesn't have an opponent right here, it will often lean to the mesial and lean to the lingual, and oftentimes there isn't a good undercut on our distal buccal, and there are good undercuts on the lingual aspect. So we're going to look at all those undercuts, but we're going to think in terms of some type of a rigid clasping on that tooth. On our mandibular tooth, it'll depend on where our undercuts are, but just looking at this, I would think we are going to want to grab an undercut, and the deepest undercut is going to be on this mesial lingual, because this tooth is leaning to the mesial, leaning to the lingual. And if we wanted to clasp, say, back here, because of the extreme lean of this tooth in this area, remember when we do a cast circumferential clasp and bring it to the distal lingual, we have to have the first 2/3 of it above the survey line. So this tooth would have to be ground on quite a bit in order to provide a survey line, possibly, that is down low enough so that the first 2/3 of that clasp arm can be above survey line. But we have another idea. We can use that surface there as our direct retention surface, And the way we can use that is that we can put a rest here, do a reciprocal component on this side, do a distal rest, and bring our arm to the mesiolingual. By doing that, we don't have to reduce this tooth quite as much in this area to get that direct retainer above the survey line in its first 2/3. So if we pick a tooth in the posterior and we pick the worst undercut, that should probably be the one we should consider for our direct retainer, so that we don't have to mutilate that surface that much if we tried to go in the opposite direction. On our canine up here, on the mandibular, because that tissue over there is kind of, flabby or not terribly supportive, and our tooth wants to pull back like this. When we chew down on something, our partial wants to do this type of action. We might put something more flexible as far as clasping on that particular tooth that we have here. Now, it is a canine. It has a long root. We have to also consider the condition of that tooth. If it has no perio problems and it doesn't have a funky little root that might be a real short conical root, which a canine doesn't usually have, if it doesn't have periodontal disease, then we can think of more rigid clasping. But when one of those conditions exists, we have to think about taking some of that torquing stress off of this canine, and we would choose a clasp that puts less stress on the tooth. We could consider either maybe a cast circumferential or an I-bar or a wrought wire on that particular tooth. We're going to have a rest on our canine and a rest on this abutment tooth. We'd like to have a mesial rest next to the edentulous area. We'd like to have a rest on this tooth. On the canine, we can put a disto-incisal angle rest if we want something that is very dependable, and it would be unfortunately a little unesthetic compared to our other option. And our other option is that we can prepare an acid etch composite cingulum rest on this tooth on the lingual surface if this patient is very aesthetic conscious. Our last little guy over here, he is the tooth on the extension base side of this partial denture, and it takes a beating when we bite down on that side. This tooth is going to have some considerable torquing forces placed on it. So on this tooth, we're going to use one of those 4 methods of clasping that were presented to you in lecture, and those were the RPI system. Again, that relieves stress. That's probably our number 1 choice. Or we can place a wrought wire. We can place a modified T-bar on it, or we can place an interproximal ring clasp or a circlet clasp that goes to the distal buccal. So we have those 4 options that we have to use on this tooth because it's on the extension base side, and we have to use one of the 4 methods that takes the torquing stresses off of that tooth. We're going to look to see where our undercuts are, and we'll choose our clasping based upon that. As far as rest, depending on the clasping that we decide we're going to use on this tooth, we would have to have a rest on the tooth next to the edentulous area. What type of major connector we would want to have in this area? We would probably think in terms of a lingual bar, but we have to have at least 8 millimeters from the floor of the mouth, which I see a frenum attachment coming up to here, so we can't violate that frenum attachment. And we would have to have 8 millimeters between the frenum attachment and our marginal gingiva. And I would say we are just like borderline on that. So we would be able to go with either our lingual bar or our lingual plate on that one. That is a measurement you have to take in the mouth with a perioprobe, because our alginate impression material pushes all the tissues out of the way, and it makes it look like we can always use a lingual bar. When I go to the patient's mouth, I ask the patient to raise his tongue up in the roof of his mouth, and I try to measure the floor of the mouth from where the functional floor raises up to the marginal gingiva. And if I have a minimum of 8 millimeters, I can use a lingual bar, because I must avoid the marginal gingiva on the mandibular by a minimum of 3 millimeters, and my bar has to be a minimum of 5 millimeters wide.